Next up, we have Phidarian Mathis, the defensive tackle out of Alabama, who, for me at least, was a pretty fun player to watch tape on. I know there were a lot of things that he did that I liked, as well as, what I would say was one sort of looming negative extraneous to the tape itself, which we'll touch on here momentarily, because I think it has to be taken into account in some way, shape, or form while evaluating him. But to start with some of the positives, I thought he was a really good pass rusher. All things considered, I thought he had very active hands. That was my first note. Always trying to disengage, always trying to make a play. And for me, that seemed to be a rarity in the guys that I was watching this year. But he really was impactful with his hands in terms of, whether it was a club, a rip, swiping with his hands, whatever it was, a swim occasionally. It felt like Phidarian had just a lot of different tools in his pass rushing tool belt and was more than willing to pull them out on occasion, and that was leading to a lot of his production, right? A lot of his pressures were coming off the usage of his hands, and he was very effective in that regard. I would say he's more nuanced as a pass rusher than many of his peers in this draft class. I would say he's also decently effective, not quite as much as he was as a pass rusher, but he was decently impactful as a run defender in terms of somebody to hold up a gap, right? I thought he was generally fine. I gave him a 14.5 out of 20, so not the best by any means, but if you want to put him, say, it's tough because I don't even know necessarily at his size and at his athletic profile, I don't know where he best fits at the next level. He would almost be a little bit big for 3 technique, but I think he doesn't necessarily play quite strong enough to be a 1 technique either. So there's a little bit of questions that I have in that regard, but I think that at the same time, you could kind of do a little bit of both, and we'll kind of get to what I meant there in a second, because if it's a passing down, say 3rd and long, something of that sort, putting a guy like Mathis in that, say, 1 technique, I wouldn't have an issue with that, because you think it's likely pass, but if it is run, you have a guy who has a little bit more strength and mass to him, say more akin to a 1 technique than if you were tossing a 280-pound D tackle in there, right? But at the same time, I wouldn't want him at 1 technique if they were just running down blocks and base blocks at him all day, right? If we're playing the Tennessee Titans and we got to stop Derrick Henry up the middle, I don't know if I want Phidarian Mathis there. So then you say, well, maybe a 4 technique, and that to me is perhaps the most interesting fit for him in a defensive 3-4, putting him head up on the tackles. The only thing I would say he needs to get a little bit better at is using his length and his hands to separate as a run defender. So what I call stacking and shedding, where you stab your hands in the chest of the offensive lineman, gain separation. Then while you're finding the ball in the backfield with your eyes, you're able to shed with your hands and then go make a play. I thought that maybe his initial positioning wasn't the worst in terms of, obviously where he's lined up, his get off, things of that nature. But then the stab and extension part didn't always seem there necessarily. So if you're going to be a 4 technique, and a lot of teams ask their 4 techniques to 2 gap, I don't necessarily know if that's a great fit either. But if you're looking for more of a pass rushing 4 technique, I think that Phidarian Mathis could be a solid player, just in terms of some of these other grades I gave him. I went a little bit high in terms of his explosiveness and first step. I gave him a 13 out of 15, which, I will say he wasn't necessarily the greatest just raw athlete, but I thought he had a really good motor, and maybe that sort of masks the former a little bit in terms of the fact that he's always going 100% makes it look like his 100% is higher, if that makes sense, because he's just going for longer than a lot of his peers. I thought his motor was his best attribute, actually. I gave him a 9 out of 10 there, which was tied for the highest that I've given any interior defensive lineman of the 20 that I've graded over the past 2 years. So what I would say is that if your team drafts Mathis, you're getting somebody who is decently refined as a pass rusher right away, but a high motor guy that maybe has some positional versatility and some fluidity up and down that defensive front. So for me, I don't even necessarily know how much I would look for him if I was just like a team that needed an every down three technique, or a team that needed a very particular position. But if I'm a team that was just a little bit light in the IDL room in general, I wouldn't hate bringing a guy like Mathis in who can do a little bit of everything and do it a little bit of everywhere, right? Um, with that being said, I guess we should probably get into the elephant in the room that I was talking about. He just turned 24 on April 26th. So, happy birthday to Phidarian. But in that regard, it sort of does change his outlook as a prospect, because he's further along in the process. He's further along in his physical and mental development, rather than, some of these guys that are 20 and 21 years old. I don't know how likely he is to get a second contract in the NFL. So if you're one of these rebuilding teams, let's just say, for example, I'm a Lions fan. Say you're the Lions. Say you're the Jaguars. Say you're the Jets. I don't necessarily know if what he brings you is good enough right away to take him in, say, day 2 or even early day 3, off the simple fact that I'm not sure he fits your timeline, right? If he's already 24, some of those teams, I don't know if they're going to win in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And in that regard, I think if I was a team taking Phidarian, I would want to be like one of those playoff teams that's just looking for somebody that we don't have to overly develop, right? We can sort of plug and play him, use him up and down the defensive front, and make our money that way, because I think there is some value there. I really do. I think there's stuff that he could improve on, certainly in terms of just some of the other negative notes that I wrote that I didn't really touch on to this point. I didn't think he was overly strong in terms of his imposing his will as a bull rusher. I thought he was more of a finesse guy, actually, which for an interior defensive lineman I thought was decently unique, but it worked for him, and maybe that's why it worked, because it was so unique. It was catching guys off guard, especially at 6'4", 312. As I mentioned, I thought leverage could be an issue. Speaking to that 6'4", there were times where he would play at all of 6'4", and it was easy for opposing offensive linemen to get up and under his pads, and I thought that was one of the reasons I gave him a little bit lower, grade against the run, just because occasionally he was giving up unnecessary ground, because I think that initial, like I said, position he was starting in. I said his block recognition can lead to displacement. What I meant by that is, when I say block recognition, it's just your ability to quickly discern, is it a run, is it a pass? If it's a run, where's the run going? Am I getting down blocked upon by a tackle, for example, and I know the run is likely going outside of him? Am I getting reached by say, a guard, and I know the play is going in that direction, right? Like, the offensive linemen generally tell you what the play is. I would say almost every play. And it just seemed like that process needed to speed up a little bit in terms of being able to recognize and react to what it is, because I gave him a 2.75 out of 5, and it just felt like when he was a little bit late, maybe some offensive linemen were already up on him before he kind of recognized what he had to do to react. So all in all, that came out to a 73.25. Add in the 4% position premium that I give defensive tackles, came out to a 76.18. So actually one of my higher third round grades. I would feel better and better about him the later I got, though, right? Because I don't really incorporate age per se into my grade, and I'm a little bit wary of that, as I said. So the later on in round 3 into perhaps day 3, if I'm a playoff team, or just a good team in general, looking for some help and another solid piece to toss in my defensive tackle room, I think a guy like Phidarian Mathis could most certainly be a successful answer to that concern, right? And in that regard, if you have any concerns, toss them in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on Mathis and just the video in general. If you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe. That way you're always in the loop with my future videos, because for this one, that's all I have for you guys today. I'm mic'd up now, I'm mic'ing out. Peace, guys. See you next time.